Glory torture primetime entertainment. When you think of Rome, your mind likely goes straight to the polished white marble columns and the deep intellectual philosophy classes. You picture noble emperors debating honor and justice in sunlit gardens, looking like statues of virtue. But what you never picture is the absolute horror waiting for the people Rome crushed under its iron heel. We aren't talking about the heat of battle, we are talking about the aftermath. When the killing stopped, the real spectacle started, and the conquered were kept alive specifically to suffer through every agonizing second of it. That is the exact moment the Roman Empire drops the masquerade. The facade crumbles, and you realize that underneath all that pomp and circumstance, there is absolutely nothing noble residing there. It was pure savagery dressed up in high-class ceremony. Because for Rome, the victory on the battlefield was just the opening act. The true nightmare was the sequel that came next. You had queens who once commanded vast empires being paraded through screaming streets, treated like exotic zoo animals for the mob's amusement. Warlords who led armies of 50,000 men spent their final breaths rotting in damp underground dungeons beneath so-called holy temples stripped of all dignity. The virgin daughters of kings were tossed to legionaries like they were nothing more than spoils of war. Their fates were sealed by cold Roman law and the roar of Roman applause. This is the same empire that invented sophisticated court systems and preached stoic discipline. Yet they engineered public degradation so extreme that even their own historians flinched when writing it down. This is that story, the one they leave out of the textbooks. We are going to walk alongside Queen Zenobia as she stumbles through the streets of Rome, wrapped in heavy golden chains designed specifically to mock her former power. We stand right there with Boudica as Roman whips tear into her flesh, while her own tribe is forced to watch in absolute horror, unable to lift a finger. We descend into the darkness of the Tullianum with Vercingetorix as the daylight disappears forever, and the crowd above roars for his blood. This is not the sanitized PG-rated version from your history class. This is the ugly truth they bury beneath fancy words like conquest and civilization to keep the illusion alive. Before we witness the darkest hours these rulers ever faced, drop a comment below with your city and country. Let us know where the remnant is watching from in 2026. Because once you see what the spirit of Rome truly was, you will never see the world the same way again. The battlefield outside Antioch is dead quiet now. No more screaming, no more clashing steel. Just Roman soldiers walking through the piles of corpses, methodically sorting the breathing from the gone. Queen Zenobia's army is completely shattered. Her commanders already know the deal. They know what defeat usually means in this world. Usually you fight, you lose, and you die with some shred of dignity left. But Rome never followed that script. They operated by a different spirit entirely. Rome had other darker plans for the living. Dead enemies send one message, but broken survivors. They broadcast a message of fear that lasts for generations. Here is what your teachers never mentioned to you. The moment that battle ended, Zenobia stopped being a person in the eyes of the Roman system. Their lawyers had a clean, sophisticated little phrase for it. Ius gentium, the law of nations. It sounds civilized. It sounds reasonable, almost modern. In reality, it meant this. If you are not Roman and you lose to the beast system, you become property. Your throne means absolutely nothing. Your past victories mean nothing. Your royal bloodline means nothing. The Roman law for defeated foreigners was brutally simple and cold. You are whatever the winner says you are. Roman citizens, even the poorest ones living in the slums, had legal protections. They could not be publicly flogged without legal proceedings. They could not be executed without a formal sentence and a trial. They had rights, at least technically speaking. Foreign prisoners had zero. The oldest Roman laws, the 12 tables from centuries before, had already made this crystal clear. Captives belong to the state or to whoever captured them. You can be sold, traded, or used however the owner sees fit. There is no court that will hear your case. No judge who cares about your sob story. The law already decided your fate the moment you lost. You are guilty of losing, and the penalty is everything. The contrast is savage. A Roman citizen standing before a magistrate is a human being under the law. A captured queen standing before a Roman general is just an asset. That is it. Yesterday she commanded legions of warriors. Today she is inventory ranked alongside shields, gold coins, horses and slaves on a logistics spreadsheet. The only question anyone asks is not what is just. The only question is how useful is she while she is still breathing. If you were a man, your future was limited and ugly. You could be sold into brutal labor that breaks your back. You could be thrown into the mines to never see the sun again. You could be dumped into an arena to bleed out for the entertainment of the masses. A few wealthy nobles might be ransomed if their families had enough gold to pay the price. If not, you became a long-term prisoner or a disposable spectacle for the mob to cheer at. Rome had perfected a diabolical system for turning defeated warriors into profit and public amusement. But if you were a woman, especially royalty, things got significantly worse. The Roman military culture treated captured women not just as prisoners but as rewards to be distributed. Some aristocratic prisoners were kept in supervised houses and handled with surface-level politeness, while deals were negotiated behind closed doors. But polite never meant safe. And that was the lucky minority. For most women, the line between prisoner of war and chattel slave existed only on a piece of paper. In real life, that line did not exist. Female captives faced forced labor, forced sex, forced marriages, and a forced transformation into household property. A royal gown could be replaced by a slave collar in a single moment, stripping away every ounce of identity she had. One day you are the daughter of a king, respected and feared. The next day you are handed from one officer to another like a piece of used furniture. No documents, no discussion, just a decision made by men who know no law will ever challenge them or hold them accountable. The empire had absolutely nothing in its legal framework that protected the dignity or the humanity of conquered women. They were never viewed as citizens with rights or souls to be saved. They were nothing more than spoils of war, human chattel. But you have to understand that the Roman system grasped a concept far deeper than simple brute force. They were masters of psychological warfare and grand theater. Rome understood the currency of terror better than anyone in history. They knew that if your goal is total global domination, simply winning a battlefield skirmish is never enough to keep the masses in line. You have to broadcast a terrifying message to anyone who would dare to resist the system. You have to take their defeat and alchemize it into a massive public spectacle. That is where the concept of the triumph enters the narrative. The triumph was far more than just a victory parade or a celebration. It was a calculated state-sponsored ritual of absolute humiliation. It was a day-long ceremony designed to establish total dominance over the mind. This wasn't something handed out lightly. Only a select handful of generals ever received the honor of a triumph. You needed a massive, undeniable victory to trigger this event. We are talking about enormous enemy casualty counts and vast new territories absorbed into the Roman machine. Once the Senate cast their vote and gave the green light, the entire city began to prepare for the show. The procession route winding through the heart of Rome stretched on for miles, a deliberate path designed for maximum exposure. From the Field of Mars, through the suffocatingly packed streets, all the way up to the Capitoline Hill, normal life ceased. Merchants shuttered their shops. Families abandoned their homes to join the mob. Humanity crushed into every available crack and crevice of the city just to witness the judgment. At the spearhead of this procession came a wall of noise and blinding color. Blaring trumpets, thundering drums, and performers worked the crowd into a frenzy, keeping the mob excited and bloodthirsty. Right behind the noise came the loot carts overflowing with captured wealth. We are talking about gold, silver weapon shields and idols ripped from the altars of foreign temples. Then came the propaganda paintings and intricate models of the destroyed cities paraded so the comfortable Roman citizens could gloat over the annihilation of lands they would never step foot in. Exotic beasts from the edges of the conquered world were dragged along in iron chains. Every single element of this parade screamed the same terrified sentence, "We took everything you had and nobody could stop us." And then came the human cost, the prisoners of war. Let me tell you, this is the part of the line where you absolutely do not want to find yourself. These were captured kings, queens, princes, and generals, along with their children. Some were stripped and dressed in rags to degrade them. Others were forced to wear their royal finery deliberately. Rome fed on that visual contrast. They wanted the mob to see the glitter of a golden crown next to the rust of heavy iron chains in the same frame. The higher you had climbed in your former life, the more entertainment value your total collapse provided to the masses. The Roman soldiers marched in gleaming, polished armor while the defeated stumbled ahead of them, wrists bound and ankles shackled, watched by thousands of hungry, judging eyes. Even Roman historians like Tacitus didn't try to sugarcoat this brutality. He documented the shame of conquered British chieftains being paraded and humiliated without a second thought. The officials in Rome never looked at this and said, "This is excessive." No, they looked at it and said, "This is effective management." Breaking the spirit and pride of royalty in full public view wasn't just a side effect of the war. It was the entire point of the operation. It broadcast a signal to every ally and enemy alike. It said, if you fight the system and lose, this is your destiny. You don't just get to disappear into the history books quietly. You will be marched, mocked, and discarded like trash when the show is over. And for the royal women, this humiliation cut even deeper into the soul. Their bodies became a living part of the propaganda message. As they walked that endless route, the crowd stared, shouted abuse, laughed, and pointed fingers. There was no one coming to save them. There were no curtains to hide behind. This death march lasted for hours. The route was deliberately slow so that every district of the city could drink in the view of their shame. For a captive queen, every single step was a brutal reminder. You are no longer a ruler of nations. You are content for the mob. Now let's bring Zenobia back into focus. She was not some minor tribal figure. She was not a puppet queen. She was the Iron Lady of Palmyra, a city that controlled the lifeblood of trade routes between the Roman world and the mysterious East. Following the Roman crisis in the 3rd century, when emperors were rising and falling within months, Zenobia saw her window of opportunity. She moved with lightning speed. She pushed her territory down into Egypt and across Syria. She was ruling lands that had been Roman provinces for generations. And you better believe Rome noticed. The empire was already hemorrhaging from internal chaos and threats on every border. Having an Eastern queen acting like a peer power was completely unacceptable to the establishment. Emperor Aurelian was not a philosopher or a diplomat. He was a professional eliminator of problems. He rebuilt Roman authority with a ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency. When he finally turned his gaze towards Zenobia, he didn't send diplomatic envoys. He sent the legions. Campaign after campaign hammered Palmyrene control into the dust. City after city was dragged back under the boot of Roman authority. Finally, near the Euphrates River, as Zenobia tried to escape east toward Persian territory, the net closed. There was no dramatic final stand, no honorable duel. She was pulled into Roman custody alive and breathing. From that instant, her life story no longer belonged to her. It was a Roman asset. Aurelian knew exactly what kind of prize he possessed. This was the woman who had the audacity to mint coins with her own face on them in lands Rome claimed. This was the queen whose armies had marched into Egypt. Killing her quietly in a cell would be a waste of an enormous propaganda weapon. Keeping her alive for a triumph would tell every governor, every general, and every foreign monarch exactly what happens when you cross the line. Try to copy her and you will end up exactly where she ends up. 2 years after her capture, Rome was finally ready. The empire had survived the storm. They had weathered invasions, economic collapse, and civil war. Aurelian had pushed the enemies back, stabilized the borders, and crushed the Palmyrene Empire that had challenged him. He needed a spectacle to cement his image as the savior of Rome and the restorer of the world. The triumph of 274 would be that grand spectacle. People flooded into the city from the countryside like a tidal wave. Rumors spread on every street corner that an Eastern queen would be displayed in chains. On the morning of the triumph, Rome transformed into a global stage. You could feel the density in the atmosphere, a spiritual heaviness composed of dust, nervous sweat, and the terrifying anticipation of judgment. The banners of the empire were draped from every building, marking the territory of the beast system. Legions of soldiers, the enforcers of this iron-fisted regime, lined the streets to keep the restless mob in check, while pagan priests prepared their blood sacrifices. Aurelian, the man of the hour, stepped out in his specific triumphal regalia, wearing the crown and the purple cloak that signified his total dominion over the known world. But look at what was happening behind the curtain, away from the cameras and the crowds. The prisoners were being staged, dressed up, and shackled in a precise order for the ritual humiliation. They didn't hide Queen Zenobia at the back of the line where she could disappear into the masses. No, they placed her right at the front, the prime position among the captives, making her the centerpiece of their victory parade. The ancient records tell us exactly what she was wearing, and pay attention because it wasn't rags or prison uniforms. It was an absurd, overwhelming amount of jewelry designed to make her shine before she fell. She was dripping in bracelets, heavy necklaces, and precious gems that covered her neck, her arms, and every inch of her dress, a dazzling display of the very wealth she used to command. But here is the kicker on top of that display of opulence. They locked heavy gold chains around her wrists and her neck. We aren't talking about thin, delicate jewelry. These were thick, weighted bands of gold designed to drag her spirit down into the dirt. The sheer mass of this gold was so crushing that she actually required attendants to walk beside her, physically supporting the weight, just so she wouldn't collapse on the pavement in front of everyone. Every single step she took was pure physical and emotional agony. Every step was a brutal reminder of the kingdom, the power, and the destiny that had been stolen from her by the Roman machine. Rome deliberately chose gold instead of iron shackles for a reason. This wasn't just about restraining a prisoner. This was about mockery, a psychological operation to show that her own wealth had become her prison. The message being sent to the nations was razor sharp and crystal clear for anyone with eyes to see. All the vast wealth she had controlled, all the strategic trade routes her empire managed, all the abundance she once commanded had been melted down and twisted into the very shackles that bound her. She was transformed into a walking, breathing display of stolen luxury. You have to understand, she ceased to be a person. She was a living billboard advertising Roman power and dominance over the East, a warning to anyone else who dared to rise up. The crowd roared like a beast as she passed by. Some of them screamed hateful insults, while others just stared in silence, mesmerized by the spectacle of a fallen queen. The children of Rome watched a powerful queen reduced to an exhausted, broken woman struggling to stay upright on the stones, while the senators watched from their VIP platforms, calculating the political stock value of Aurelian's success. Foreign ambassadors from other kingdoms were watching closely, taking mental notes on exactly what happens when you cross the superpower of the day. This is exactly what the system does to rulers who forget their place in the hierarchy. This is the high cost of rebellion transformed into a live televised performance for the masses. Can you imagine what was going through Zenobia's mind during those agonizing hours? She was a student of history. She knew the Roman traditions and the blood rituals they loved. She knew that the end of a triumph procession usually signaled the end of a life. She knew that other captured leaders had walked this exact path of shame and never walked out of the city alive again. She remembered Vercingetorix of Gaul, who resisted Julius Caesar, was paraded just like this and then was strangled to death in a cold dungeon beneath the Capitoline Hill. She thought of Jugurtha of Numidia, who had marched in these same chains stripped of his glory. He was thrown into a pit and starved to death in the darkness, while the people celebrated above his head. The pattern of the beast was unmistakable and historically consistent. The script was always the same: walk the route, entertain the bloodthirsty city, and then die quietly in the dark. The procession began to climb the slope toward the Capitoline Hill. The noise of the mob intensified to a deafening roar, then began to fade into a hush as the procession reached its final critical stage. The pagan temples loomed over them like giants. The priests moved forward to initiate the final phase. Somewhere right nearby, the entrance to the underground prison was waiting, the abyss where so many defeated enemies had vanished from the earth. Zenobia had no idea if she would be dragged into that hole when the cheering stopped. She didn't know if this humiliating march was the last thing her eyes would ever see in the land of the living. The chains were cutting deep into her skin. The heavy jewelry was digging into her shoulders, and the unrelenting sun was beating down on her, exposing her completely. The queen, who had once dictated terms to entire provinces and commanded armies, now waited for one man, Aurelian, to decide if she would live in a luxury villa or die in a hole in the rock. And as she reached that critical point where other rulers had been dragged away to their final darkness, a heavy question hung in the air like a thick fog. Would Rome turn her into just another corpse buried beneath the hill? Or would they turn her into something even more useful to their agenda than a dead martyr? Aurelian, playing the role of a god on earth, made his final decision. When the triumph finally ended and the crowd scattered to their homes, Zenobia did not descend into the rock beneath the Capitoline. No rope was tightened around her throat, and there was no silent execution in the dark. Instead, the emperor did something more calculated. He transformed her into a permanent ornament for his victory, a living trophy to sit on his shelf. He gave her a house, some land near Rome, and a controlled existence under constant surveillance. It wasn't freedom and it wasn't death. It was a grey zone, a limbo designed to neutralize her completely. The ancient writers tell us she ended up in a villa outside the city near Tiber, what we now call Tivoli, a place with nice gardens, servants, and fine food, but with invisible walls she could not cross without permission. Some historical sources claim she was married off to a Roman senator completely assimilated into the system she fought against. Others say her daughters were married into respectable Roman families, effectively breeding the rebellion out of her bloodline forever. The details might be murky, and historians still argue over the fine print, but the basic prophetic picture is crystal clear. She never returned to her throne. She became an exhibit in Rome's high society world. Think about the spiritual implications of what that actually means for a leader. Every time she appeared at a banquet, every time she walked through an Italian garden, she was a living reminder of defeat. Guests could look at her and think, that woman once ruled from Egypt to Anatolia and now she's just a guest. Now she lives here simply because a Roman emperor decided to allow her to exist. She became a pet of the state. Her survival was not mercy in any pure or biblical sense. It was pure strategy. Aurelian got to display a living symbol of his dominance for years, rather than just enjoying while you Zenobia's story exposes one of Rome's favorite tricks, a tactic still used by the elite powers of 2026. They don't always kill their enemies physically. Sometimes they break them psychologically, then dress the shattered pieces in designer clothes and place them in gilded cages to show the world who is really in charge. Listen, family, for a true king or queen. There is a fate far more terrifying than a clean execution by the sword. It is the psychological warfare of surviving while they strip away your crown, your heritage, and your dignity, forcing you to exist as a living billboard for their victory and your total defeat. But you have to understand, not every bloodline was willing to let the beast system of Rome dictate their ending or write them out of history. There were rulers who refused to be paraded in chains for the amusement of the Gentiles, rulers who would not let the empire turn their sacred legacy into mere trophies for a wicked society. And in this specific case, Rome pushed its disrespect and humiliation so far past the line that it sparked a spiritual and physical fire that nearly burned their entire house of cards to the ground. We need to shift our focus from the deserts of the East and transport our minds to the cold, misty island of Britain. We are looking at the year 60 CE. But the spirit of what happened there is alive and well right now in 2026.
The man sitting on the throne of the world is Nero. While he sits in the East playing the artist and living in filthy luxury like the elites of today, he ignores the groans of the people.
Meanwhile, in the West, his bureaucrats are bleeding the provinces dry, extracting wealth through taxes and oppression. One of those victims is Britain, a land partly conquered and partly managed through these so-called friendly puppet kings who sold out their own people. One of these sellouts was a man named Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe. This man thought he could play politics with the devil, thinking he could beat Rome at its own game of deception. He took their handouts, accepted their protection, and sat on a local throne, deluding himself into thinking he could secure his family's generational wealth by making the oppressor a partner in his last will and testament. He split his inheritance down the middle, giving half his kingdom to the Emperor Nero and the other half to his two daughters. It was a desperate, foolish gamble, trying to balance the scales with a beast that has no honor. He thought if he gave the system a slice of the pie, they would let his children eat in peace. But he failed to realize that Rome, just like Babylon, does not care about your contracts, your clever arrangements, or your appeasement.
The moment Prasutagus took his last breath, the imperial procurator Catus Decianus showed up at the door. Understand this, a procurator was nothing more than a glorified repo man the empire's financial hitman sent to collect.
His only assignment was to squeeze every ounce of gold and silver out of the provinces to fund the lavish lifestyles of the wicked in the capital. This man looked at the will, laughed at the lands, and tossed the legal documents in the trash. The Roman officials didn't just take their half. They seized everything lock, stock, and barrel. They treated the Iceni kingdom like it was property they had owned all along, acting as if this was just an eviction notice. They confiscated the land, the livestock, and the legacy. The local nobility, the leaders of the people, were stripped of their status, beaten down and enslaved. Those predatory loans the Roman bankers had pushed on them suddenly came due with interest enforced by the brutal iron fist of the legions. Behind all the fancy legal jargon and bureaucratic talk, it was plain and simple robbery, sanctioned by the state and protected by the highest powers of the empire. And when Queen Boudica, the widow of Prasutagus, stood up to speak truth to power, she received her answer in the most public, humiliating way the enemy could devise. Tacitus, a Roman historian whose own father-in-law served in Britain, wrote down the details of this atrocity, documenting the true nature of the beast for future generations to see. These Roman officers ordered Boudica to be flogged right in front of her own tribe. They tied her down, raised the whip, and tore into her flesh, trying to break her spirit along with her body. Stroke after stroke rained down. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a traitor. She was the queen of an allied nation that had fought side by side with Rome, but none of that loyalty mattered to them. They didn't stop because they had a point to prove. They wanted every single person watching to understand clearly who held the whip and who held the chains. But see, this is where they messed up. You have to understand the hypocrisy here. If a Roman woman of high status was beaten in public, it would bring down the government in a scandal. Even a Roman male citizen couldn't be whipped without a trial. It was a sacred right. But for Boudica, she had no protection. She was outside the circle of citizenship, considered less than human by their laws. That made her open season. Her pain was a calculated message to her people. Your leaders, your queens, your mothers, they only exist because we allow it. Then the enemy took it to a darker level. They went after her daughters. 2 young women of royal blood, unmarried, innocent, representing the future of the tribe. Tacitus doesn't paint a graphic picture. He uses sharp, cold words and moves on quickly, because even a Roman pagan had a hard time stomaching the depravity of his own soldiers. These girls were assaulted, and it wasn't done in the shadows or in secret. It was done in the open, ensuring that the tribe saw the violation of their most sacred treasures. The goal wasn't just physical harm, it was spiritual destruction. They wanted to crush the lineage, to grind the dominance of Rome into the deepest wounds of the family unit so they would never rise again. This was not an accident. This wasn't a few bad apples or soldiers losing control in the heat of the moment. This was a calculated demonic strategy. This was government policy backed by a corrupt legal system that saw no crime in destroying a family that wasn't Roman. Boudica and her daughters had no rights that the oppressor felt obligated to respect. They were used as instruments in a brutal lesson: resist us and this is your fate. But family watch what happens when you push a people too far. The lesson backfired completely. Instead of creating fear and obedience, it birthed a rage so intense, so righteous, that it nearly tore the Roman presence in Britain to shreds. Boudica didn't crawl into a hole and accept her status as a victim. While the wounds on her back were still fresh, she began moving from village to village, rallying the spirit of her ancestors. Other tribes who had been pushed around and abused by these corrupt Roman governors started to open their ears and listen to the call for war. Warriors who had watched their lands get stolen and their friends get sold into slavery began to gather. Many of them had been trained in the Roman auxiliary units. They knew the enemy's tactics and they knew how the legions fought. But more importantly, they knew the truth. If they sat still and did nothing, the abuse would continue until their people were wiped off the face of the earth. The army that Boudica raised was biblical in scale. We are talking tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 souls, if the Roman estimates are to be believed. Men grabbed swords, spears, axes, anything they could get their hands on. Women rode in chariots, and the elders shouted for vengeance. The whole nation woke up. This wasn't a professional standing army like the soulless Roman legions. This was a nation with a grudge, a people filled with the wrath of judgment. Their first target was Camulodunum, a Roman colony built on stolen land, a symbol of their displacement and oppression. Inside that city stood a temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, a stone idol of Roman rule that the locals were forced to pay taxes to maintain. Boudica's forces didn't just attack, they brought the judgment. They burned the buildings to the ground, they slaughtered the settlers who occupied their land, and they completely wiped out the military garrison. There was no negotiation, there was no surrender, there was no mercy. Rome had taught them exactly what mercy looked like, and they returned that lesson with interest. Next on the list was Londinium, the ancient version of London. Back then, it was a bustling hub of trade, packed with merchants and Romanized Britons who had sold their souls for a piece of the empire's wealth. The Roman governor Suetonius Paullinus looked at the strategic map and realized he was completely outmatched. understanding that the forces at his command were nowhere near enough to hold back the tidal wave of righteous indignation coming his way. So, he made the kind of ruthless, cold-blooded decision that the elite always make when their power is threatened. He chose to cut his losses, abandon the civilian population to their fate, and retreat to preserve his military structure for a final showdown down the road. Everyone who was left behind to fend for themselves had to face the full, unbridled wrath of Boudica and her people, as her army flooded into Londinium like a river of judgment and ground the entire city into dust. The fires of retribution burned with such intense spiritual and physical heat that archaeologists digging in the earth today can still find a distinct blood-red layer of ash and debris, a permanent scar in the soil testifying to the destruction. It didn't matter who you were, merchants, families, collaborators, or just bystanders. If you were caught within the walls of that wicked city, you were swept away by the sword and the flame without mercy. Verulamium was the next stronghold to fall, meeting the exact same apocalyptic end, meaning that 3 major centers of Roman authority and idolatry in Britain were wiped off the map in a lightning-fast campaign of liberation. The historian Tacitus, who was essentially the mainstream media of his day, claims that around 70,000 Romans and their sympathizers were taken out during this uprising, and even if he was inflating the numbers for effect, the sheer scale of the devastation was absolutely biblical. Boudica took all the shame, the abuse, and the public humiliation that the Roman beast system had tried to dump on her, and she hurled it right back into their faces with compound interest. She refused to be another victim marching in chains to their capital. Instead, she turned their own prized provinces into massive graveyards, reminding them that you cannot oppress a people forever without consequences. Eventually, however, Suetonius Paulinus maneuvered his forces to a location where he could dictate the terms of engagement, choosing a narrow battlefield where Roman military technology and discipline could neutralize the sheer numbers of the freedom fighters. Boudica's warriors, fueled by passion and the desire for justice, lined up in the front, ready to throw themselves against the iron teeth of the empire one last time. Behind the front lines, they had positioned their wagons and their families, wives, children, elders, creating a wall that blocked any chance of retreat, showing they were all in for Toto. Boudica rode out before her people. And according to the records, she didn't speak like a politician negotiating a deal or a monarch claiming a legal right, but like a furious mother and a woman standing up against a system of abuse. Her message was clear and powerful. I am not standing here as a queen begging to get my crown back. I'm standing here as one of you, a regular person who has been beaten, stripped of dignity, and forced to watch my own daughters be violated by these monsters. She declared, "These Romans look at us and see nothing but property and slaves. But today, right here and right now, we are going to prove to them that we are free human beings." The speech, recorded by history, is raw and visceral, focusing on the physical scourging and the horrific crimes committed against her bloodline, as the undeniable justification for this war of annihilation. This was the scenario that kept the Roman elite awake at night. Their worst nightmare coming true. Private acts of brutality sparking a massive public awakening that threatened to topple their control over the entire region. But the battle itself ended in a horrific tragedy for the resistance, because once the Roman legions had the space to operate their war machine, they functioned like efficient, cold-blooded killing robots. Their tightly packed formation, superior heavy armor, and rigid discipline allowed them to slice through the chaotic, passionate ranks of the British warriors like a hot knife through butter. When the front line of the resistance finally broke under the pressure, there was absolutely nowhere for them to run, because the wall of wagons behind them turned from a symbol of resolve into a deadly trap. And Tacitus describes the result as a wholesale slaughter. It was a massacre of biblical proportions, with men, women, and even children being cut down mercilessly as they tried to scramble over their own carts to escape the Roman sword. Boudica watched the collapse of her rebellion and understood with crystal clarity what was coming next if she allowed the enemy to put their hands on her, because she knew exactly how the Roman system operated. She knew the dark fate that awaited royal women who defied the empire and lost. She knew what a Roman triumph really meant, even if she had never walked the streets of Rome herself. She visualized the ropes, the mocking crowds, the long, slow death march, and the cold iron chains biting into her flesh, and she absolutely refused to be dragged across the sea to be paraded as a curiosity for the amusement of the mob. So, She made the ultimate choice and took poison, deciding to end her own life on her own terms, rather than letting the Roman establishment write the final chapter of her story. She denied them the satisfaction of the Mamertine prison, she denied them the golden chains, and she denied them the spectacle of marching her broken body through a foreign capital. She chose a quick exit to the ancestral realm over becoming a living, breathing trophy for a tyrant, and sadly her daughters disappear from the historical record completely after the initial trauma. There was no last-minute rescue, no Hollywood ending, and no closure, just a deafening silence, which might be the most chilling and tragic aspect of this entire historical episode. Look at the contrast with Queen Zenobia, who endured the humiliation of the triumph, and was allowed to live out her days in a controlled, comfortable captivity, serving as a quiet living symbol of Roman dominance. Boudica, on the other hand, chose to burn their cities to the ground and refused to ever let them see her in bondage, dying, with her spirit unbroken and her pride intact. Here you have two queens with two completely different responses to the exact same beast system that viewed them as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded once they were defeated. The truth is, Rome's real power wasn't just in its soldiers or weapons. It was in the terrifying lengths it was willing to go to crush the spirit and the pride of anyone who dared to stand up and say no. But we have to ask ourselves, what happened to the leaders who didn't get to make a choice, the ones who were cornered with no way out? I'm talking about the ones who weren't spared like Zenobia and didn't manage to escape on their own terms like Boudica, the ones Rome dragged through the streets and then literally erased from the face of the earth. For those unfortunate souls, the end came in a terrifying location that still sits beneath the streets of modern-day Rome, even though millions of tourists walk right over it without a clue of the darkness below. Buried under the Capitoline Hill, right next to the political nerve center of the ancient city, stood the Tullianum, which later became known to the world as the infamous Mamertine prison. If you looked at it from the street, it seemed like just another stone building, but on the inside it was designed as a horrific two-level dungeon of despair. The upper chamber was essentially a holding cell, a waiting room where high-profile political prisoners were kept on ice before their final judgment was handed down. But the lower chamber, which you could only get to through a small hole in the floor, was the execution chamber, the place where the Empire's dirty work was finished. And this wasn't some sprawling jail complex. It was a claustrophobic, damp, suffocating pit carved straight into the bedrock, pitch black with zero light and no door to the outside world. You were lowered down into the darkness like a bucket into a well. The only way out was the same way you came in, but usually that only happened after the life had been choked out of you. Ancient writers described it as a place of filth, freezing cold and air so foul it was hard to breathe. If the deep state of Rome wanted you to disappear permanently, this was the place that did the job quietly and efficiently. Now let's bring the story of Vercingetorix into this picture. This man had achieved something that was considered impossible. At the time, he managed to unite the fractured and warring Gallic tribes into a single coalition against the expansion of Julius Caesar. He had forced Caesar, the ultimate strategist, into some of the hardest battles of his career, pinning down Roman legions and nearly flipping the entire script on the history of Roman conquest in Gaul. But his final stand at the fortress of Alesia ended in a crushing surrender when the Roman blockade starved his army into submission, sealing his fate within the belly of the beast. Caesar didn't keep him breathing out of some misplaced sense of mercy or kindness. That's not how the beast operates. He kept him alive because he was already visualizing the prophecy of his own ego, planning a massive satanic ritual of triumph right in the heart of Rome, with this dangerous enemy on full display for the masses. For 6 agonizing years, Vercingetorix sat in chains, a prisoner of war in a land that hated him. 6 years of knowing that his judgment wasn't cancelled, it was just rescheduled for a time that suited the political narrative of his captors. They kept him locked away in the dark while Caesar finished his bloody wars and maneuvered through his political chess games. By the time they dragged him out to Rome for the grand spectacle in the year 46 BCE, the timing was perfect for their agenda. He was no longer that powerful, proud leader sitting high on horseback, commanding the respect of nations. The system had ground him down. He was thin, broken, and completely transformed by the brutality of his captivity. And let's be real, family, that is exactly how Rome, the mother of harlots, wanted him to look. On the day of Caesar's great triumph, we see the same pattern of humiliation that the elites use to this day. They paraded the stolen wealth gold paintings, captured standards exotic animals, a literal river of plundered goods flowing into the capital as stolen from the indigenous tribes they conquered. Then came the human cargo, the prisoners with Vercingetorix leading the pack at the front. The Roman citizens leaned out desperate to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had been blasted in their propaganda speeches and letters for years. This was the so-called rebel, the resistance leader, who almost shattered their general's wicked campaign and halted the expansion of the empire. He walked through the streets that were vibrating with cheers for the very tyrant who had destroyed his people's freedom and sovereignty. The route climbed higher and higher toward the Capitoline Hill, the seat of their pagan power. The temples were open and ready for blood sacrifice. The atmosphere was thick with the smoke of incense and the roar of the mob. But at a specific point near the hill, the procession split because the true darkness happens away from the cameras. The mind-controlled crowd surged forward to watch Caesar continue his glory march toward the temple of their false god Jupiter. Very few people paid attention to where the prisoners were being taken. They had served their purpose as props in the theater of war. The city had seen them humbled, and that was enough to satisfy their bloodlust. Now the rest of the ritual would take place out of sight in the shadows. Guarded by heavily armed soldiers, Vercingetorix was led to the entrance of the Tullianum, a place of absolute dread. It was nothing but cold stone iron bars and a small, terrifying doorway. Inside there was a floor with a hole leading to the pit below. He knew exactly what this was. The spirit of death was heavy in that place. Every foreign noble, every king who refused to bow to the beast system brought here understood the assignment. Some begged for their lives, some stayed silent in meditation, and others cursed the devils who held them captive. But understand this, none of them ever walked back out of that dungeon. The guards prepared the strangulation rope. The hole gaped beneath him like the mouth of hell. Above ground, Caesar's triumph rolled on with drums beating and crowds shouting his name in idolatry. But below, in the stale, suffocating air under the hill, a different, darker ritual was about to be initiated. Vercingetorix, the man who had once rallied an entire continent to stand against the tyranny of Rome, stood on the edge of that abyss, waiting for the final move in this deadly game. The executioner's rope tightened around Vercingetorix's neck. There was no grand speech, no final words recorded for the history books, because the victors are the ones who write the history. One moment he was standing on the rough stones of the upper chamber, a man who had once made the foundations of Rome tremble with fear. The next moment, he was being lowered through the opening into the black void below. The lower cell, the belly of the beast, consumed him completely. There were no torches down there to light the way, no adoring crowd, no music. Only the cold sound of soldiers doing their dirty work above, and the faint mocking echo of celebration bleeding in from the streets. The lower chamber of the Tullianum was never built for comfort or rehabilitation. It was built for total erasure, to wipe a man's existence from the face of the earth. The stone walls wept with moisture, like they were crying for the blood spilled there. The air was suffocating and toxic. The floor was uneven, damp, and fouled by the rotting remains of the bodies that had come before him. You see, in this system, the mighty do not receive grand executions on public platforms to inspire martyrs. They do not get the dignity of fire or spectacle. They die strangled in the dark, treated like common criminals whose names the empire wants you to forget forever. Vercingetorix, the warrior who had dragged Caesar into desperate battles and forced the Iron Legions to fight for every single inch of Gaul, met his end here with a dirty rope crushing his throat. Meanwhile, above his head, the triumph continued. Caesar rode in his golden chariot, wearing a laurel crown like a god absorbing the worship of the people he ruled over. The priests sacrificed white bulls at the temple of Jupiter in a blood ritual. The musicians played their hypnotic tunes. The whole city feasted on the spoils of war. But down below, Vercingetorix's body sagged against the cold stone as the life force drained from it. When the deed was finished, soldiers would haul him back up or drag him out through a sewer passage, disposing of him like he was garbage. That was the final step in the process of domination, turning a king into refuse. He went from a feared enemy to a gasping target, to a corpse rotting under a hill. Also, Caesar could point and declare to the world, "Look what happens to those who stand in my way." But listen closely, because he was not the only one. Rome turned this brutality into a pattern, a cycle that we see repeating even in 2026. Another king, Jugurtha of Numidia, a powerful man from the motherland, received the same treatment, only his demise was slower and even more cruel. Jugurtha had been a serious problem for the Roman establishment. He ruled a strategic part of North Africa, and he knew exactly how the system worked. He knew how to exploit their greed with money and alliances. When the corrupt senators arrived, he simply paid them off. When their generals marched on him, he stalled, he bribed, and he ambushed them. He understood that Rome's core was corruption, and he weaponized their own greed against them. The Jugurthine War dragged on for years, exposing just how rotten and compromised Roman politics had truly become. It sounds a lot like what we see in our government today. It humiliated the so-called Republic. Eventually, the Romans found a general who could not be bought, a man named Gaius Marius, to do the dirty work. Jugurtha was eventually betrayed by an ally and handed over to his enemies. That should have been the end of it, but Rome-Babylon was not satisfied with simply removing him from the board. The system wanted a performance. It wanted to send a message to the other nations. They wanted to demonstrate that even this clever, slippery African king who had once mocked their power and bought their leaders could be crushed in public. In the year 104 BCE, Jugurtha was paraded in Marius's triumph. By then, he was no longer dressed in the royal garments of a ruler. He was a wreck broken by the dungeon. The chains bit deep into his melanated skin. He had been held in captivity long enough to strip away his health, his dignity, and his pride. People who had followed the war recognized him and shouted insults at the fallen king. For the brainwashed masses, he was proof that Rome, when it finally focused its military-industrial complex, could clean up its messes and dominate the world. For Marius, he was just a prop, a moving symbol of victory for his political career. After the march came the final stop, the dreaded Tullianum, where the lights go out. It is the same old story, the same demonic cycle we see playing out right now in the headlines of 2026. They took Jugurtha, a king of the south, a man of royal African blood. And they didn't just drag him, they desecrated him. The minions of the empire stripped him bare, ripping the golden earrings from his flesh with such savage hate that they tore his lobes apart. They shoved him violently toward that gaping maw of the earth, that abyss that swallows the righteous. The history books tell us that as he descended into that foul, waterless cistern, his mind snapped under the spiritual weight of the evil surrounding him. He screamed out, mocking their false gods, "By Hercules, how cold is this bath of yours?" But catch the prophecy in his words. It wasn't a bath, it was a tomb for the living. This is the spirit of Rome, the spirit of Babylon, cold, unyielding, and devoid of light. They didn't grant him the mercy of a quick execution. No, they locked him in absolute darkness. No bread, no water, no light of the sun, just a slow, agonizing erasure of a human soul in the belly of the beast. Here was a king who had commanded thousands of strategists who knew the art of war and diplomacy, now reduced to clawing at damp stone walls in the pitch black, realizing the system has no honor. He held on for 6 long days. Starvation and thirst did the dirty work for the empire. Up on the streets, the mobs laughed and told tall tales about the clever African lion who was finally broken by the Iron Kingdom. But down in the deep, his royal body lay in silence, a witness against the wickedness of the nations. And he wasn't alone. Vercingetorix Jugurtha. These are just the names that survived the purge. Think of the thousands of Israelites, Gauls, and Syrians whose names were blotted out from the record. Some were kings of gold and commerce. Some were essentially freedom fighters leading the resistance with nothing but faith and a few rusty swords against the iron legions. It doesn't matter who you are. The beast system processes everyone through the same grinder. Capture the body parade, the image humiliate the spirit, and dispose of the evidence. Sometimes they choke you out in a dungeon. Sometimes they make a spectacle of your death on prime time. Sometimes they just let you rot in a black site prison that doesn't officially exist. And look at the psychological warfare. Sometimes they keep you alive, like Zenobia. They turn you into a trophy, a controlled opposition figure to parade around. Not every captive gets the sword immediately. No, the craftier ones are kept as political tools, pawns in a much larger game of global dominance. A defeated prince might be dragged through the mud and then raised in a Roman house, brainwashed and molded to be a puppet leader for the next generation. They might let a former king live in a villa under constant surveillance just to prove they have the power of life and death. But never get it twisted. The choice always belongs to the oppressor. Their laws, their statutes, they were never meant to protect us. The system doesn't even recognize the oppressed as fully human beings with God-given rights. That is the heart of the prophecy we are watching unfold today. The legal language of the West looks pristine and careful when you study it in law school. They use terms like international law or the law of nations, sounding so civilized, like we are all playing by the same rules on a level playing field. But in reality, those laws draw a hard exclusionary circle around the citizens of the beast and their sellout allies. Once you step outside that circle, you are fair game. If your people resist the New World Order and lose your status as a person. The system that preaches justice suddenly goes blind. You become chattel property. Your body, your offspring, your dignity, it all belongs to the conqueror. This is the spiritual slavery that hasn't ended. Let's look deeper at the evidence we've uncovered in these files. Zenobia, a queen who ruled the East, is decked out in heavy, suffocating gold chains and forced to march until her muscles give out. It represents the burden of false wealth. She survives, but only as a sterile symbol in a gilded cage, forever watched by the all-seeing eye of the state. Boudica, who saw her inheritance stolen, is whipped publicly. Her daughters are violated just to send a terror message to the tribes, do not rebel. Royal blood is no shield against this evil. She burned their cities, but in the end she took her own life, rather than wear their chains. Vercingetorix waits 6 years for a staged execution, strangled in the dark, while Caesar drinks the wine of victory above soaking in the adulation. Jugurtha starves in the belly of the earth after being paraded as a prize. Different lands, different hues, different wars, but the same satanic pattern repeats itself. The minute you fall, the protections of citizenship evaporate. The law doesn't care about your character or your spirit. Your courage, your wisdom, your code of honor, none of that currency spends here. The only thing that matters is how your suffering can serve the narrative of the empire. These triumphs weren't just parties, they were rituals. They were psychological weapons. Living propaganda. They told the world exactly what happens when you stand up against the iron teeth of the system. They reminded the puppet kings that their leash is only as long as Rome finds it convenient for their agenda. They showed the citizens that the state is God, unstoppable and all-powerful, crushing all opposition under its heavy boot. And the message went deep into the psyche of the nations, watching from afar, instilling a spirit of fear. If you were a leader on the fringes of the empire, and you heard what they did to the African king or the Gallic chief, you had a hard choice to make. Do you trust in the Most High and fight, or do you bow the knee, sign the treaties, and sell your soul? You pay the tribute and pray your children never feel the Roman rope around their necks. This is how the mystery of iniquity works. It's not just armies, it's fear. It's the media narratives, the public humiliations, and the hidden torture chambers like the Mamertine. One side shows you the shame in high definition. The other side finishes the job in the dark where no one can hear you scream. But what's truly diabolical is how they clean up the crime scene over the centuries. Open a textbook in 2026, and you see words like civilization, integration, and progress. The triumph is painted as a glorious parade, not a death march. They describe that dungeon as just an ancient site with a nice little chapel built on top hiding the blood in the soil. Tourists walk through, snap pictures on their phones, and move on to lunch. They don't stand there and feel the spirits of the men who died of thirst right beneath their feet. While the masses above were distracted by the spectacles and cheering for the empire, the cold, demonic stone structure beneath the Capitoline Hill stood as a silent witness to the truth. Today, that dungeon sits right in the belly of the beast, surrounded by a city overflowing with busy cafes, gridlocked traffic, and tourists clueless to the spiritual reality. On the surface, Rome tries to sell you a fantasy, the majestic Colosseum, the Forum, the fountains, and those picturesque ruins glowing at sunset. But if you dig a little deeper, right underneath the religious veneer of a church, the ancient execution chamber remains pulsating with a dark history that they do not want you to feel. You can physically step inside that pit, feel the heavy dampness clinging to your skin, and study those rough, unforgiving walls. The atmosphere is small, cramped, and spiritually oppressive, like the walls are closing in on your soul. It is entirely too easy to walk through that space without grasping the weight of it, without realizing that this tiny room was the final site for so many powerful leaders who dared to stand against the global order of their day. See the massive gap between the polished image Rome projected to the world and the brutal way it actually operated is the master key to unlocking the truth about the system we are living in right now. On one hand, they dazzle you with high-minded philosophy, complex law codes, Latin literature, public baths, aqueducts, and magnificent architecture that screams power and stability. But flip that coin and you see a beast system that would strip a sovereign queen of her dignity in a heartbeat. Drag a royal king through the streets in iron chains, or publicly scourge the matriarch of an allied tribe just because some greedy bureaucrat lusted after more land and gold. You can stand there and marvel at the technical prowess of Roman engineering, but you have to keep it 100% real about the absolute savagery and bloodlust that held that concrete together. You can be fascinated by the discipline of the legions, but you must recognize that every single one of their victories was fuel for a machine built entirely on the ritual humiliation of God's people. If anything, grasping this duality makes the history and the prophecy come alive. It stops being just a pretty postcard of white marble statues and reveals itself for what it truly was in the spiritual realm. A fallen world where the law was a shield for the elite and a weapon against the righteous, and where the highest honors of the state were constructed on the broken backs and suffering of human beings who were deliberately turned into objects. So the next time you hear the word triumph, do not just picture some celebrated general riding high in a chariot while the brainwashed crowds cheer him on. I want you to picture Queen Zenobia weighed down her shoulders, screaming in pain under the heavy golden chains of her captivity. I want you to visualize Boudica rising up after a public scourging, plotting righteous vengeance while the bruises on her skin were still burning with fresh fire. Picture Vercingetorix standing at the precipice of that black abyss in the prison floor, or Jugurtha blindly feeling his way around a freezing cold cell, coming to the horrific realization that no saviors are coming to rescue him. Then you need to ask yourself the real question. What did Rome and the systems that follow in its footsteps actually fear more? Was it the enemy armies or was it the enemy's story? Because every single chain, every public beating, and every execution in that hellhole was designed for more than just physical punishment. It was a ritual designed to control the narrative and suppress the spirit. Their goal was to ensure that when the nation spoke about Rome, they spoke with trembling fear, not a shred of hope. If you have stuck with this message all the way to the end, I appreciate you being part of the remnant that seeks the truth. Most people are content with the sanitized, whitewashed version of Rome, but you chose to look at the dark reality that the textbooks and the mainstream media rush past. If you are hungry for more hidden history and prophetic insight like this, make sure you smash that subscribe button and hit the like, so this truth breaks through the suppression and does not get buried by the algorithm. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these fallen kings or queens you want me to do a full deep dive expose on next. And do not forget to share this broadcast with someone who is still asleep, someone who thinks Roman glory was just marble statues, togas, and ancient wisdom. It is time to let them see what was really hiding underneath the crown.